May 5th, 1945, by 0720 hours. Wageningen, Western Netherlands. Staff Sergeant William Cooper of the 101st Airborne Division stood on the outskirts of the small Dutch town, observing civilians slowly emerging from their homes as American forces advanced through the streets. He had witnessed liberated populations before, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and expected the usual scenes: celebrations, flags waving, people cheering, perhaps some wine and kisses from grateful locals. But what he saw this time froze him in place. The people moving toward the American convoy weren't celebrating. They shuffled forward, the elderly moving like frail shadows, adults supporting one another, and children who looked more like specters than living beings. A young girl, perhaps 7, stood by the side of the road wearing a dress that had been altered repeatedly to fit her shrinking body. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide in hollowed sockets, her legs thin like twigs, all but swallowed by the wooden clogs that were likely her only shoes. As Cooper's jeep halted, the girl took a tentative step forward, gazing at the Americans with an expression of desperate hope, mingled with the caution of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. She didn't wave or smile. She simply stood, swaying slightly, too weak for anything more than standing. Cooper reached into his pack and pulled out a D-ration chocolate bar. He knelt down, extending it toward her. For a moment he wondered if she recognized what it was. Then with startling speed, her hand shot out, grabbed the chocolate and pressed it to her chest as if it were the most valuable thing she had ever held. Tears began to streak down her hollow cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered in barely audible English. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Behind her more children appeared. 20, 30, 40 of them, each one skeletal, staring at the Americans with the same mixture of hope and disbelief. Cooper looked at his men and saw the shock on their faces as they absorbed the horror of months of starvation that had ravaged an entire generation of children. "Break out all the rations," Cooper ordered quietly. "Everything we've got. These kids are starving to death." What followed was a beautiful chaos. American soldiers distributing every scrap of food they carried. Children crying as they clutched chocolate, crackers, and canned meat. Dutch parents collapsing to their knees in gratitude. And hardened combat veterans discovering that feeding starving children was more meaningful than any battle they had fought. For the Dutch civilians of Western Netherlands, who had endured the hunger winter of 44-45, American liberation meant more than military victory or political freedom. It meant food for children who had been dying from starvation. It meant the end of watching their own sons and daughters wither away while they were powerless to stop it. It meant the moment when hope, which had been all but extinguished by months of systematic deprivation, was miraculously reignited. The hunger winter that devastated Western Netherlands from September 1944 through May 1945 was not a natural disaster or a mere consequence of warfare. It was a deliberate German policy designed to punish Dutch civilians for supporting Allied operations and to maximize suffering during the final months of occupation. The statistics were grim. Approximately 4.5 million Dutch civilians were affected. Deaths directly linked to starvation ranged from 18,000 to 22,000. An estimated 2,500 to 3,000 children perished, while countless more showed severe signs of malnutrition upon liberation. By February 1945, the daily caloric intake in Western Netherlands had plummeted to between 400 and 800 calories per person, well below survival levels. Food distribution had ceased entirely for several weeks in early 1945, and by January there was essentially no fuel left for heating. The crisis began in September 1944, when the Dutch government in exile called for a railway strike to support Allied operations following the failure of the Market Garden offensive. In retaliation, the German authorities imposed a food embargo on Western Netherlands, cutting off supplies to the country's most densely populated region. The timing of this embargo was disastrous. It began just as winter was approaching, at a time when stored food from the harvest would have usually sustained the population through the cold months. With the railway system paralyzed and German forces blocking road transport, Western Netherlands became an isolated food desert, where existing food stocks were consumed within weeks, and no resupply was possible. German occupation authorities showed a systematic indifference to the suffering of Dutch civilians. Requests for food relief were ignored or denied, and appeals to international humanitarian organizations were blocked. This deliberate policy was clearly articulated in German military communications, which outlined that Dutch support for Allied operations would be punished through deprivation, creating an object lesson on the costs of resistance. The descent into hunger followed a predictable pattern, documented by Dutch civilians in diaries, letters, and testimonies that survived the war. The decline from relative adequacy to crisis to catastrophe happened gradually, but then suddenly, as each threshold of desperation was crossed. From September to October 1944, rationing tightened but remained minimally adequate. Families consumed stored food, hoping the embargo would end quickly, maintaining relative normalcy despite shortages. By November and December 1944, rations had dropped below subsistence levels. Families began to consume everything, burning furniture for fuel, stripping gardens of any edible plant, and killing pets for meat. The first deaths from starvation were reported, primarily among the elderly and infirm. Between January and March 1945, the situation reached full catastrophe. Ration distribution became sporadic, then ceased entirely for weeks at a time. Families resorted to boiling tulip bulbs, which were toxic but provided some minimal calories. Sugar beets, normally used for livestock feed, became a precious food source. Deaths accelerated dramatically. By April 1945, the peak of suffering had arrived. Spring was approaching, but no food reserves had survived the winter, and death rates reached their highest levels. Parents watched helplessly as their children wasted away, unable to provide even minimal nutrition. Mass graves were dug for starvation victims, and entire communities hovered on the brink of collapse. The psychological toll of watching children starve was captured in countless testimonies. Parents described the unbearable agony of having nothing to feed their hungry children, of watching them grow weaker every day, and of making impossible decisions about how to divide inadequate food among multiple children. The despair was overwhelming, knowing their children were dying and they were powerless to save them. Anna Vandenberg, a mother of 3 in Amsterdam, wrote in her diary in March 1945, "Today my youngest asked for bread. I had none." She cried, then stopped crying because she's too weak to cry for long. She's 7 years old and weighs perhaps 30 pounds. I watch her dying and can do nothing. If the Americans don't come soon, she won't survive. None of them will. I pray to God for food, but God seems as far away as the Americans. Children bore the heaviest burden during the hunger winter, as their growing bodies required nourishment that simply wasn't available. The physiological effects of severe childhood malnutrition were meticulously documented by Dutch doctors, who maintained medical records under the most difficult conditions. The symptoms followed a predictable progression: initial weight loss, then muscle wasting, followed by edema caused by protein deficiency, and ultimately organ failure, which preceded death. Children's bodies began to consume their own tissues to maintain basic functions, while their immune systems collapsed, leaving them vulnerable to diseases that would have been minor under normal conditions. Schools that remained open became grim reminders of the crisis. Teachers reported seeing children fainting from hunger during lessons. Some children were too weak to walk to school, while others fell asleep at their desks, as conserving energy became more important than education. The few teachers who still had food would share small portions with students who appeared closest to death. Dr. Henrik Mulder, a pediatrician in Rotterdam who treated starving children throughout the crisis, documented the medical reality. By March 1945, he wrote, I was seeing children in conditions I had only read about in medical texts on famine, kwashiorkor, marasmus, severe vitamin deficiencies, causing blindness and bone deformities. Children aged 10, who weighed what healthy 5-year-olds should weigh. Some were past the point where food could save them. Their organs had been too damaged by months of starvation. All I could do was make them comfortable while they died. The psychological toll on children was equally devastating. Chronic hunger consumed their every thought. They became listless, withdrawn, and unable to engage in normal childhood activities. Some children became obsessed with food, constantly talking about meals they remembered from before the embargo. Others ceased talking about food altogether because discussing what they couldn't have was too painful. The Allied dilemma. As Allied forces advanced through Europe in early 1945, strategic priorities delayed the liberation of Western Netherlands. The region was not directly on the path to Germany, and the German forces there did not pose a significant military threat. Diverting resources to liberate Western Netherlands would slow the advance into Germany and could potentially prolong the war. However, Allied commanders were aware of the growing humanitarian crisis behind German lines. Intelligence reports, communications from the Dutch resistance, and information from refugees highlighted the severe starvation conditions. The strategic decision became increasingly uncomfortable. Pursue the fastest military victory while Dutch civilians starved, or divert resources to humanitarian relief while the war continued. The initial decision was to prioritize military advance. Western Netherlands would be liberated as part of the final operations after Germany's defeat. In the meantime, Allied forces attempted to provide some relief through airdrops of food supplies to starving regions. These were carried out through Operation Manna by the RAF and Operation Chow Hound by the USAF. The airdrops began in late April 1945 after negotiations with German commanders, who agreed not to fire on Allied aircraft engaged in humanitarian missions. British and American bombers, which had previously carried destruction to German cities, now carried food to Dutch civilians, dropping supplies over designated zones where starving populations could collect them. While these airdrops provided crucial relief, they couldn't solve the crisis. Supplies reached only a fraction of the affected population. Distribution was chaotic, and critically, children who were already dying from starvation needed immediate, sustained nutrition that occasional airdrops could not provide. Full liberation and systematic food relief would be necessary to address the devastation. The ground liberation remained necessary. When Allied ground forces finally liberated Western Netherlands in early May 1945, coinciding with Germany's surrender, they encountered a humanitarian crisis far greater than intelligence reports had conveyed. The statistics had documented malnutrition and deaths, but they hadn't captured the raw reality of entire communities on the brink of collapse. As American and Canadian forces advanced into Western Netherlands, they found populations that were not only desperate for liberation, but too weak to properly celebrate it. The traditional scenes of joyous liberation, dancing in the streets, cheering crowds, flowers thrown at soldiers, were replaced by more subdued but profoundly emotional responses from people who had been starved for months. Captain Thomas Morrison, whose company was among the first American units into Wageningen, described the scene. "We expected celebrations. What we got was something more moving and heartbreaking. People came out of their homes slowly, cautiously, as if they weren't sure they had enough energy to spare for celebration. When they saw we had food and that we were distributing it immediately, many just broke down crying. Grown men weeping, women collapsing to their knees in gratitude, children staring at chocolate bars like they had forgotten such things existed. It was the most emotional liberation I'd experienced in the entire war. The immediate priority became feeding the starving population as quickly as possible. Combat units that had once focused on military objectives found themselves engaged in massive humanitarian efforts. Every available food supply was distributed and field kitchens prepared meals continuously. Medical personnel triaged the most severely malnourished for urgent treatment. For American soldiers who participated in the feeding operations in the Netherlands, this work was among the most meaningful of their entire military service. They had fought across Europe, won battles and defeated German forces, but feeding Dutch children who were starving to death felt more significant than any combat victory. The soldiers' response went beyond following orders or completing assigned missions. They gave away personal supplies, shared their rations, and spent off-duty time playing with Dutch children and helping families. The humanitarian work became a personal investment in helping people they had come to care about. Private First Class Eugene Henderson wrote to his family in Massachusetts in May 1945, "We're feeding Dutch families who haven't had real food in months. The children cry when you give them chocolate, not because they're sad, but because they're so grateful they can't contain the emotion. Yesterday, a little girl gave me a flower she'd picked. It was the only thing she had to give, and she wanted me to have it because I'd given her food. I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. This is why we fought the war, so children like her could have flowers instead of starvation." The cultural connections formed between American soldiers and Dutch civilians were immediate and deep. The Netherlands was a Western European nation with cultural similarities to America, democratic traditions, populations that spoke some English, and the connection felt easier and more natural than in some other liberated territories. Dutch families opened their homes to American soldiers, sharing what little they had recovered. Americans responded with food, supplies, and friendship. Children followed American soldiers everywhere, practicing their English, asking about America, and showing them around the recovered towns. The relationships transcended military occupation to something far more personal. The friendships that formed between American soldiers and Dutch civilians became genuine cross-cultural bonds. The recovery of Dutch children from severe malnutrition required months of careful nutrition and medical care. Bodies that had been systematically starved could not simply resume normal function once food became available. The rehabilitation process was gradual, supervised, and often complicated by medical issues arising from prolonged deprivation. American and Allied medical personnel established specialized clinics to treat childhood malnutrition. These facilities provided supervised feeding, vitamin supplementation, treatment for diseases that flourished during starvation, and constant monitoring for complications. The care was comprehensive and represented a significant commitment of medical resources to the civilian population. The psychological recovery of the children was just as important and equally complex. Children who had spent months or years living with chronic hunger, witnessing others die from starvation, and experiencing the terror of not knowing whether they would survive, needed more than just food. They required safety, stability, and time to process the trauma. Allied personnel organized schools, recreational programs, and activities designed to help Dutch children recover normal childhood experiences. American soldiers played baseball with the Dutch children, taught them American songs, and organized various games and events. These activities were more than just entertainment. They served as psychological rehabilitation, helping the children regain lost moments of normalcy. The core of the story of Dutch civilians breaking down when American soldiers saved their children was never about military strategy or political liberation. It was about the most fundamental human obligation, feeding hungry children. And what happens when nations with resources choose to use those resources for humanitarian purposes rather than solely military objectives? The American soldiers who broke out their rations and fed starving Dutch children weren't simply following orders or completing missions. Most were violating regulations about conserving military supplies. They made moral choices to prioritize human suffering over logistical efficiency, deciding that feeding dying children mattered more than maintaining supply reserves. For combat units, the Dutch civilians who broke down crying when Americans arrived with food were not celebrating political liberation or military victory. They were experiencing the overwhelming relief of parents who had watched their children die from starvation, only to suddenly and miraculously have food to give them. The tears were about life and death at its most fundamental level. These were children who would live instead of die because strangers with resources chose to share them. The liberation of the Netherlands demonstrated that victory could mean more than defeating armies. It could mean saving children from starvation, showing that democratic societies valued human life enough to mobilize vast resources for humanitarian causes. It could also mean creating enduring bonds between nations. One nation remembered that another nation had saved its children when they were dying. For the Dutch children who survived the hunger winter because American soldiers gave them food, the experience shaped their entire understanding of what America represented. They grew up knowing that Americans had saved them, that democratic societies could be both militarily powerful and deeply compassionate, that enemies could become liberators who cared whether children lived or died. For the American soldiers involved in feeding operations, the experience provided meaning that transcended their military service. They had helped win a war, but more importantly, they had saved children's lives. They had been part of something that showed humanity's capacity for compassion, even amidst the brutality of total war. The skeletal children in wooden clogs, who had stared at chocolate bars like they were miracles, who had cried because strangers were kind to them, who had experienced hope returning after months of despair, these children lived. They grew up healthy, raised their own children in prosperity and peace, and became living evidence that mercy could triumph over systematic cruelty. Civilization could choose to feed the hungry rather than ignore their suffering. And even in war's darkest moments, individuals who chose compassion could change the world. One chocolate bar, one can of rations, one moment of kindness at a time.